On June 18th, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo was fought between the belligerent nations of France, England, and Prussia. The circumstances leading up to the battle began when the Emperor Napoleon I returned to France from exile, rallied the French army, and they led an invasion of Belgium. Belgium was at this time occupied by two allied armies under the commands of the Duke of Wellington and Marshal von Blücher. Wellington commanded a small army which was composed of some British and some Belgian militia and other soldiers, while von Blücher commanded a Prussian army. Blücher's force was slightly larger than Wellington's, but neither army was nearly as large as that which Napoleon invaded with. However, although individually they weren't as big as Napoleon, combined they actually outnumbered him. So, when Napoleon invaded Belgium, his first objective was to drive his army in between those of the Allies. This he was able to do, and he fought two battles in an attempt to defeat both of them separately. These were inconclusive, the battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras. They did not go very well, and they were not decisive. So, as a result, the Allies both retreated straight north in a parallel direction. The British retreating straight north to the juncture of the Mount St. Jean road, and the Prussians retreating straight north to Wavre. From this position, there was a fine road running between the two, so they would be easy to link up with each other. Napoleon, to pursue them, also divided his force. He commanded the bulk army, which was going to attack Wellington, and he dispatched a third of his army under the command of Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians and keep them from rejoining Wellington. So in the end, here was how the situation was right before the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon was lined up to fight Wellington at the juncture of the Mount St. Jean road, just a few miles south of the village of Waterloo. The Prussians retreated to Wavre and were preparing to march to Wellington's aid, and Grouchy was marching straight north to pursue and try to block off the Prussians. On the morning of June 18th, the battlefield of Waterloo looked much like this. Incidentally, the slightly darker, large areas here are elevated ground. In this case, the British are occupying up here, the French down here. You'll note there are 4 houses involved in this battle and 1 town. The House of Hougoumont, or the Chateau of Hougoumont, the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte, the House of Papelotte, and the House of La Haye. And to the rear of the French is the town of Plancenoit. Plancenoit did not play a very important role at the start of the battle, but by the end it was a very important facet of it. So keep your eye on it. The British, as you'll note, are occupying a ridge along here with reserves hidden behind. This was one of Wellington's key tactics. He was a veteran soldier from the Peninsular War and had learned quite a bit from his fighting in Spain. Accordingly, one of his favorite trademark tactics to do was to put a thin screen of troops in the front and have the bulk of his soldiers behind. That way then the enemy couldn't tell just how many soldiers he had currently on the field. Napoleon, as you can see, set up his force in a semicircle. This was so, if the need be, he could encircle Wellington's army. It turned out he never did, but it was in case he wanted to later on. Also, I'd like to point out this thin bar here. This represents the Grand Battery, which was a very important facet of the battle. The Grand Battery was Napoleon's concentration of every single gun in his whole army. Every cannon, every 12-pounder, 6-pounder, etc., every cannon that he had was lined up along this ridge. The purpose of it was so that he could initiate a combined and concentrated artillery bombardment on a specific area. Now, Napoleon's strategy at Waterloo was not very interesting, but he thought it would work. It involved first launching a portion of his left against Wellington's position at Hougoumont. Hougoumont was heavily fortified, but it was pretty weak. because as you can see, nothing is there really to prevent the French from encircling around. So, by launching an attack on Hougoumont, Napoleon hoped to induce Wellington to move his reserves in the center here over to support Hougoumont. Once that happened then, Napoleon would launch his strongest part of his army, under the command of d'Erlon here, these 3 blue units here, in an attack on the center of Wellington, which he hoped would entirely break him in two. From there, he would use his cavalry to entirely wind up and rout the Anglo-Allied army. So, the attack began at 11:30 a.m. with Corps Commander Ryle of the French left launching his corps in an attack on Hougoumont. Now, it would seem that numbers would prevail here. He launched 4 whole divisions against the position at Hougoumont. But, despite the numbers, it was a complete loss for the French. The defenders at Hougoumont were the Coldstream Guards, and they held out very well. They not only successfully defended Hougoumont, but they repulsed the attack. The attack resulted in heavy French casualties, and Wellington was not obliged to move any of his reserves over to help the Coldstream Guards, so it was a complete failure for Napoleon's plan. So, the question now that Napoleon had to consider was, would he go ahead to launch his center assault, even though Wellington still had his reserves there? It turned out that he decided that yes, he would. Accordingly, he sent orders to his Grand Battery to launch a concentrated barrage straight at Wellington's center. Now, most of the troops in Wellington's center here are on the reverse slopes of the ridge. However, one brigade was out in front. This was under the command of Major General von Bylandt, and it was composed mostly of Dutch and Belgian militia, so it was not very strong, and it was not very well trained. It was mostly recruits. As a result of the artillery bombardment, the brigade broke, and the men all ran back behind the cover of the ridge. This did serve, however, to help Wellington out, because it deceived Napoleon into thinking that the artillery bombardment was doing a lot more damage than it really was. In fact, because most of Wellington's army was behind the ridge, Napoleon's gunners couldn't even see them. So in fact, the only brigade that really got the worst of it was Bylandt's. Napoleon didn't know this, however. I'm sorry. My visual aid here goofed up. There we are. Napoleon didn't understand this, however, so he accordingly launched d'Erlon's force in a massive center assault on Wellington's army. It was a complete rout. D'Erlon's force was cut to pieces. D'Erlon himself was killed. And the victory was compounded by a charge of Ponsonby's excellent brigade of heavy cavalry, which entirely drove d'Erlon's force to complete and total rout in an entire and complete waste of men and resources.